Hello and welcome to KU Padasala once again. I am Dr. Sarita ji. Now that we have already discussed the Anglo-Saxon invasion and the Norman conquest in the first segment, we will now see the significance of the fall of Constantinople in British history. Constantinople was originally a small Greek-speaking city in the Roman Empire located along the Bosporus Strait. The original name for Constantinople was Byzantine. The Byzantines were Romans who maintained Greek and Roman culture, and they also made huge wealth as the epicenter of trade between Asia, Europe and Africa. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 AD marked the final collapse of the Roman Empire. The Ottomans were Turks who were an ethnic group of nomads that originated in Central Asia. They organized themselves under one Turkish dynasty and conquered much of Anatolia. Anatolia is also known as Asia Minor, and it is the largest peninsula in Western Asia. It constitutes the major part of the modern day Turkey. For Western Europe, the fall of Constantinople had perhaps one silver lining. The fall of Constantinople into the hands of the Ottoman Turks in 1453 AD drove the Greek scholars of the Eastern Empire to Italy and other countries of Europe, and wherever they went, they sowed the seeds of the new spirit and ideas. Thus, the new Greek learning spread faster in Western Europe, and eventually the waves of the new Greek learning began to sweep over the whole of England and brought with it a revival of Greek and Roman studies that eventually led to the development of Renaissance humanism and science. Renaissance. Renaissance is a multi-headed term. It is a French word. Not all that easy to define. Anyway, it marks the beginning of the modern age. The literal meaning of the word Renaissance is rebirth or revival, and it was the revival of art and letters in Europe under the influence of Greek and Latin classics. The masterpieces of ancient Greek and Latin literature were called classics. In short, Renaissance is the new spirit that influenced literature, art, architecture, sculpture, painting, music, scientific inventions, geographic exploration, religion, and morality towards the end of the Middle Ages and also the beginning of the modern age. In the early Middle Ages, the study of Greek and Latin classics was discouraged by the church because it was dangerous to the very existence of the church. This period is called the Dark Age, not without a reason. It is a period when blind faith dominated over reason or intelligence. There was no intellectual freedom, and the church controlled the mind and imprisoned the thought. But by the end of the 14th century, there was a change in the very outlook of man. Blind faith and unquestioning obedience gave way to a spirit of inquiry and freedom of thought. People began to see things in a new light, and each and every act was motivated by a spirit of criticism of the old beliefs. So to put it briefly, it was the beginning of the birth of the modern mind. The age of self-repression ended and the new age of self-expression began. In Italy, the movement produced great innovations in various fields like art, science and literature in England and Germany also. It nurtured a spirit of criticism and inquiry, which ultimately led to the Reformation. There are some factors that contributed to the Renaissance towards the end of the Middle Ages. Now I'll recount some of the reasons. One was the end of the supremacy of the church over the mind of man, fall of Constantinople, the invention of the printing press, Protestant revolt, we will discuss that next, the influence of Arab civilization, geographic discoveries, the crusades that changed the outlook of Christians and inspired them to go beyond the church and also seek things beyond the church. An intellectual change came over the people, and this intellectual change came to be called the Renaissance or classical revival. This Renaissance can be defined as the intellectual change that came over the people of Europe, and it marks the transition from the medieval to the modern. Humanism. Humanism is a cultural movement. It is a cultural movement in Renaissance Europe, and it was characterized by a revival of classical letters, an individualistic and critical spirit, and also a shift from the religious to secular concerns. The movement dates back to the 13th century and the work of Florentine scholar-statesman Brunetto Latini. It is also called Renaissance humanism. It was first employed as humanismus by the 19th century German scholars to describe the Renaissance emphasis on classical studies in education. The term thus implied not only the qualities that we normally associate with the modern word humanity, like understanding, compassion, benevolence, and so on, but also such more assertive characteristics like endurance, judgment, judiciousness, eloquence, and dignity. Consequently, the possessor of humanitas could not be merely a sedentary or an isolated philosopher or man of letters, but he was of necessity a participant in active life. The source of humanitas was classical literature. Greek and Roman thought, available in a flood of rediscovered manuscripts or newly translated manuscripts, provided humanism with much of its basic structure and method. Humanism may be accurately defined as that Renaissance movement that had as its central focus the ideal of humanitas. Renaissance humanism was an intellectual movement characterized by a revived interest in the classical world and studies which focused not on religion but on what it is to be human. By the 15th century, humanism had spread across Europe. The humanist movement can be traced back to a trio of Italian authors who lived before the Renaissance period had even begun: Dante Alighieri, Petrarch, and Boccaccio. Authors like Petrarch unearthed the lost ancient manuscripts. The main elements of Renaissance humanism include an interest in studying literature and art, an interest in the eloquent use of Latin and philology, a belief in the importance and power of education, the promotion of private and civic virtue, a rejection of scholasticism, the encouragement of non-religious studies, emphasis on the individual and their moral autonomy, a belief in the importance of observation, critical analysis, and creativity, and a belief that poets, writers, and artists can lead humanity to a better way of living, and finally, an interest in the question what it means to be human. Reformation. Another word for the Reformation is the Protestant Revolt. Reformation or the Protestant Revolt is a common name given to all religious movements directed against the drawbacks of the church, particularly against the objectionable practices of the clergy towards the end of the 15th century and the beginning of the 16th century. I'll explain some of the causes of Reformation. So during this period, as I mentioned earlier, the church controlled the mind of the people. It imprisoned thought, it stunted literary and artistic developments. At the same time, it also encouraged immoral activities. This was the period of the Renaissance. The critical attitude of the modern mind, began to question many of the cardinal teachings of the Church. Thus, the main reasons were Renaissance and also Humanism that sowed the seeds of the great religious revolution. Thus, the Reformation was the great religious revolution that shattered the Church, that shattered Christendom in the 16th century. The movement created a clear split in the Christian Church. The Christians were divided into Roman Catholics, that is, the Roman Catholics were the Christians who supported the Pope, and the people who protested against Roman Catholicism became the Protestants. Protestants, they broke away from the Roman Catholic Church in protest against the corrupt practices. Medieval Church was actually in dire need of a reform. People were earlier ignorant, they were superstitious, and they just blindly followed the medieval church. But later certain developments took place, particularly towards the close of the Middle Ages, that led to the Reformation of the medieval church. The church was reformed, and this led to the establishment of Protestant churches. Renaissance was one of the chief causes of Reformation. Reformation has also been described as the product or the child of Renaissance. That is, if Renaissance had not happened, Reformation also would not have happened. Renaissance was the birth or revival of classical learning, and Reformation was the product of Renaissance. So it is because of Renaissance that they started to think. Earlier they were blindly accepting whatever was told to them. They blindly followed the teachings of the church. But after Renaissance, they began to think, they began to inquire, they began to criticize the evils of the church. And thus it is the immoral and the corrupt clergy that who became responsible for Reformation. So once again, we'll just recount the chief causes of Reformation. Number one, Renaissance. Second, the immoral and corrupt behavior of the clergy. There was unnecessary interference of the church in the affairs of the state. Another reason was Babylonian captivity that affected the prestige of the church. The term Babylonian captivity has been used to describe the period of time when the Jewish people were kept captive after the conquest of Judah. This happened during a time when people were no longer located in Rome and instead lived in France. So this was referred to as the Babylonian captivity of the church. Then the Great Schism was the next reason for the separation of the church into two. People were burdened with tax. They started opposing it, and the opposition of the people began to weaken the church and strengthen monarchy. Books written by writers like Wycliffe and Thomas More, the famous author of Utopia, they disclosed the follies of the church and also paved the way for Reformation. Growth of national consciousness among the people of Europe. They began to resist the temptations of the Pope to interfere in the personal affairs of the people. And finally, the challenge of absolute monarchs to the Pope's authority. People wanted to destroy the monopoly of the church over wealth. Germany was the home of Reformation, just as Italy was the cradle of Renaissance. Martin Luther was an Augustine monk, and he was the prophet of Reformation in Germany. He was horrified at the worldly life of the Pope and also the cardinals when he visited Rome in 1510 AD. In 1517, Pope Leo X sent a Dominican friar to Germany to raise money for rebuilding St. Paul's Cathedral in Rome. He was hoping to raise money through the sale of indulgences, granting remission of sins on payment of money. That is, people could just give money and buy pardon. This was an abuse of the Pope's authority, and Martin Luther wrote 95 theses attacking the abuses of the church, and then he pinned them on to the door of the church in Wittenberg in 1517. He stood firm in his heretical teachings, as a result of which he was excommunicated. Martin Luther, however, had a huge following, and this resulted in the split of the church into two, the Catholic and the Protestant. Thus, the Reformation led to many religious wars in Europe with terrible consequences. And we will discuss Reformation in England. The significant factors that became responsible for Reformation in England were the corruption and also the immorality of the clergy, the hatred of the head of the church, and also the spread of new learning in Europe, which was Renaissance. Thus, the seeds of Reformation were sown. Thus, the seeds of Reformation were sowed by English kings. William the Conqueror, who was a staunch Catholic, was against the authority of the Pope. The third son of William the Conqueror was William Rufus. He also followed the footsteps of his predecessors. Henry II also opposed papal authority and issued the Constitution of Clarendon that attempted to curtail the power and the authority of the Pope. The organization of the church was bitterly criticized by scholars like John Wycliffe, who attacked the doctrines of Christianity and abuses of the church. Wycliffe came to be called the morning star of Reformation. It was Wycliffe who had translated the Latin Bible into English for the use of lay people. His disciple John Huss revived the movement, but he was burnt alive as a heretic. The English came to be influenced by the criticisms of great humanists and scholars like John Colet, Erasmus, and Thomas More. Martin Luther's Lutheranism was imported to England by wandering preachers, and in the 16th century, Henry VIII introduced a new type of Protestantism, and this came to be called Anglicanism. Earlier, the kings were in favor of Roman Catholicism, and Henry VIII had even written a book supporting the Pope and refuting the theses of Martin Luther. But he had problems with the Pope on issues of divorce and remarriage. Henry VIII was married to his brother's widow, Catherine of Arabel, who was 8 years older than him. He had from her only one child, Mary, and he wanted a son to succeed him. Moreover, he was also in love with a lady called Anne Boleyn, whom he wanted to marry. So he appealed to the Pope in order to permit him to divorce Catherine. But it so happened that the Pope was a puppet in the hands of Emperor Charles V of Spain, who was the nephew of Catherine. So he just delayed that decision, and Henry VIII was very angry, and he retaliated by obtaining the right to divorce Catherine from an English court, and he also tried to bring about a change in the Catholic Church, and thus brought a Reformation in England. Introduction of the printing press. In the medieval world, books were handwritten, and as such they were very few in number and could be used only by a privileged few. No spread of civilization or advancement of learning could at all be possible in such a situation. The invention of printing and the introduction of the printing press became a great aid to spread knowledge and carry it forward. This was much required in the release of medieval Europe from darkness to the enlightenment of the Renaissance. John Gutenberg of Germany was the first person to operate successfully a printing machine towards the middle of the 15th century. He was successfully followed by William Caxton, an Englishman who introduced a more improved type of printing press in 1476. That constitutes an important landmark in the advancement of learning and knowledge in England. His invention of the movable type printing press led to the creation of one of the Western world's first major printed books, the 42-line Bible. It is the process of printing initiated by him that contributed much to the multiplication of the number of books, number of readers, and also the stabilization of the position of different writers. Printing was in fact found instrumental to the expansion of literary activities and also to the cultivation of literary standards and tastes. Caxton saw the printing industry in its emergence, and he was strongly impressed by the German printing technology. He immediately started his own printing business in Bruges and printed his first book in English in 1473, which was the Recueil of the Histories of Troy, which was translated by Caxton himself. His contribution to the growth of knowledge and learning deserves high commendation. English literature definitely has been much enriched by this venture. In fact, the art of printing introduced by Caxton became widespread. Books came to be printed in huge numbers and circulated widely. The printing press proved to be a carrier of civilization, and that has remained firmly confirmed by the development of English literature after him. His translation became so popular at the Burgundian court and that everybody wanted a copy, and Caxton began to think seriously about setting up a printing press printing press in England, and he established a printing company in Westminster in 1476. The first book he printed was Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Caxton is credited with having contributed to the standardization of English, homogenization of dialects through his publication. The vocabulary of English was expanded, word forms were changed, and syntax was adjusted, widening the gap between spoken and written English. William Langland, probably the greatest of the religious poets of medieval England. His book, Piers the Ploughman, describes a series of remarkable visions that pass before the dreamer. The poem can be considered from a threefold aspect. Number one, as a picture of contemporary life and manners. Two, a satire upon ecclesiastical abuses and the fallacies and vices of his age. Langland bitterly criticizes those who do not do honest work. He desires better social conditions and less corruption in the church. But he was a conservative reformer who does not desire a radical reorganization of the church or a transformation of the society upon lines of equality. 3. The work is also an allegory of life. The good and the bad qualities of human nature strive for mastery, and among them moves Piers himself. He is a laborer working with his hands, but he is also a symbol for Christ. We will now discuss the beginnings of English drama. Drama, the earliest of all the imitative arts, has been defined as an articulate story presented in action. The origin of drama has always been deeply rooted in the religious instinct of mankind. Greek tragedy is widely believed to be an extension of the ancient rites carried out in honor of Dionysus, the Greek god of wine and fertile earth. The beginnings of English drama can be traced back to the time of the Romans, who had built their amphitheatres in England. The cradle of drama, particularly in England, rested on the altar. That is, it was used to teach doctrinal truths of religion to the ignorant masses. The gospel truths were demonstrated by a series of living pictures in which performance enacted the story in dumb show. Later, plays were written by clergy, by the clerics or priests, and they came to be known as the mysteries or miracles. The term mystery is applied to all stories taken from the scripture narrative, while miracles are based on the incidents in the life of saints or martyrs. Miracle play is one of the earliest example of a miracle play concerns Saint Nicholas, and this was written in Latin with Old French refrain. The performances gradually they started becoming more elaborate. Music was introduced, and then they were no longer mere ritualistic ceremonies but real dramas. After some time, churches started becoming very crowded, and so it became necessary to enact these plays in the churchyards, and on account of desecration they were removed to open spaces and streets. Thus, the first stage in the development of drama is marked by the performance of stories in churches. In the second stage, the plays emerged from the church into marketplaces, and guilds were entrusted with performances in the 14th century. When laymen began to act in them, comic interludes were introduced. The simple miracle play evolved into a series of plays that begin with the creation, covering the chief events in Bible, and also ending with the day of judgment. The third stage is reached when the mystery and miracle plays gave place to morality plays. A morality is a drama in which the characters are allegorical, they are symbolic or abstract. The main purpose of the plays was didactic. The most popular morality play is Every Man, and in that play he shows how the Father of Heaven summons every man, sends death to summon every man to come and give an account of his life on earth. The characters typified certain qualities. Gradually, real people with idiosyncrasies were introduced, and in order to relieve the seriousness of the problem, the medieval problem plays. Now I need to talk about Vice, a peculiar character. He was allowed to enter between the scenes and also amuse the people with a humorous interlude. Devil was also a comic character in them. The morality plays approach nearer to the actual drama, where the abstract virtues and vices were replaced by real characters. Interlude is an early form of dramatic entertainment. It is considered to be a transition between medieval morality plays and Tudor dramas. Interludes were performed in courts either by professional minstrels or amateurs at intervals between some other entertainment. John Haywood, one of the most famous interlude writers, brought the genre to perfection in his works, The Play of the Weather, and also the play called The 4PP. The Earl of Essex is known to have had a company of interlude players. The interludes of John Haywood stand midway between the morality and regular drama, since in the interludes the allegorical characters have disappeared. The interludes of John Haywood stand midway between the morality plays and the regular drama. Thomas More. Thomas More, Sir Thomas More, also called Saint Thomas More. He was an English humanist and statesman, and also the Chancellor of England. But he was beheaded for refusing to accept King Henry VIII as the head of the Church of England. He was recognized as a saint by the Roman Catholic Church. Sir Thomas More has also been called the English Socrates and a man for all seasons. His life is one of the most interesting ones in the annals of biography. His work, Utopia is the greatest and the most memorable work in Latin. It is a commentary on, or a reaction to, the political, social, economic, religious and moral scene of the late 15th and early 16th century England. In the first book of Utopia, Thomas More analyzes in detail the social evil that surrounded the England of his times. He suggests the means by which they can be eradicated. The book may be treated as an earnest appeal for social reforms, made for the England of his times, or it can also be seen as a good-humored satire on contemporary England, European city-states. The second book of Utopia is a fable of the moral sort and intends to instruct the readers about private and public morality. The name Utopia is derived from Greek roots and it means nowhere. It presents a picture of an ideal world in a very desirable place to live in, almost a heaven on earth. Taking the form of a socialist or a communist propaganda, the book can also be read as a humorous account of Thomas More's ideas of what a welfare state should look like from the viewpoint of a whimsical scholar or a statesman indulging in pipe dreams. Utopia is essentially a textbook for prospective rulers written by a humanist administrator. So that brings us to the close of the first module titled Pre-Elizabethan Literature. In the next segment, we will discuss the second module of the paper, British Literature. Thank you for listening.